Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 129. Where should you use an ellipsis in Python? How does it behave as a placeholder in a script, project, or stub file? What are the next goals for the Faster Cpython project? This week on the show, Christopher Trudeau is here, bringing another batch of PyCoders Weekly articles and projects. We talk about a Real Python article that covers when you should use an ellipsis in Python. We discuss the similarities with the pass keyword and how it's used for type hints within stub files. Christopher shares resources covering the goals of the Faster Cpython project. We're on the cusp of the release of Python 3.11, but the project keeps moving forward as they look at ways to continue speeding up Python. We share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a news roundup, hosting alternatives for Python-based applications, creating custom Python strings, a discussion about aging programmers, creating a structural diff that understands syntax, and a project for refurbishing and modernizing Python codebases. This episode is sponsored by InfluxDB. InfluxDB time series platform is built to handle the massive volumes of time series data produced by sensors, apps, and systems. Are you building real-time applications? Check it out at influxdata.com. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Christopher, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
We have a couple little short news items to kind of begin with. We're going to have a nice, good discussion that's very near and dear to our hearts, I guess. So.
Our old failing hearts, spoiler alert.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, that's right. So first little chunk of news is there's been a security release for Django. So 4.1.2, 4.0.8, and 3.2.16. It resolves a potential denial of service attack with internationalized URLs. So get your fixes out there before you end up in trouble. And then the second piece of news is a new PEP has surfaced. It's PEP 698. It's called Override Decorator for Static Typing. The idea here is to provide a decorator that is a type hint for methods in a child class that override their parent's method. If this gets accepted, tools like MyPy or your IDE will be able to warn you if there's an incompatible change between the child and parent. So say you renamed a parent's method but forgot to rename the child method that was overriding it, that would normally only ever show up at runtime when you tried to call super. With this decorator, the typing tools will be able to warn you about the mistake. So it'll be interesting to see if it gets accepted.
It's funny how many little pieces of typing and enhancements keep building up every release.
It seems to be a common thing. Yeah. We'll talk more about that next week with 3.11.
Yeah, definitely. That brings us into our topics this week. And the first one was, I guess, kind of a news one, but it's an article written after the news kind of broke. People might be aware that Heroku has changed their pricing plan. They have had a free tier for a long time, and they're discontinuing that. Heroku, as a organization, is owned by Salesforce. I don't know if they're pushing it one way or the other, but one of the things about that is a lot of tutorials, just even some of RealPython's own tutorials, have been written with the idea that, you should be able just to pop that into a free tier plan. This article is addressing it. It's titled Heroku Alternatives for Python-Based Applications. It's by Nick Tomazik on testdriven.io. I think it's a really well done survey of these things. It actually dives a little deeper into, what is Heroku and what was its sort of specialty at first? I have liked using Heroku, especially in the tutorial space, because it didn't really require you to get too deep into the DevOps part, which is very nice. It also has a very handy integration with Git. It really leverages using Git commits being able to kind of watch when you commit something new, that it will just version and redeploy and do a lot of the sort of CI/CD kind of stuff for you, which is really nice. And I guess that kind of is what defines it differently. It's a PaaS, a platform as a service, versus some of the other things that are out there where you have to provision your own virtual machine, work on the networking, deal with all the other kinds of little things that are really not Python specific. And that's, I think, partly why a lot of tutorials use tools like it to point to. And Heroku is great. I mean, it's a great service and people should pay for things, but I totally understand tutorials not wanting to require an investment to get into it. And another note, Real Python is hosted on Heroku and it's done really well for us there. So one thing in this pro and con list that he starts with Heroku about, he mentions again multiple pros that I've already listed a little bit. Its popularity is one of its pros, I guess, also, and its ability to do a lot of that scaling for you, either vertically or horizontally. It is very dashboard kind of based, where you have a hand on some of the controls, but a lot of it is happening for you behind the scenes, which a lot of people would prefer either way more ability to look at the status of things and understand what's happening. So I can see that as a pro and a con. And also another real pro is it comes with a very nice CLI that you can install and just do the sort of git commit kind of stuff right from your command line. Pricing is higher, partly because it is more of a platform as a service. It is a little lacking in some of the regions also. So I won't do every one of these, but I will mention that if you're looking for alternatives to it, this does a really good job of providing you pros and cons, a lot of variety, and mostly leaning toward the platform on as a service kind of thing for the people that are less wanting to become a DevOps pro and more, hey, I want to host my Python project or my Python based application. So the first one that he gets into after that is DigitalOcean's app platform, which you might have heard ads for. It has a very simple free plan, I think, unless you host like 3 static sites, but most of the services are charged also. It has integrated CI/CD also, which works with GitHub and GitLab. There's a service he mentions called Render, which I hadn't heard of, but it's fairly new. It's launched in 2019. It includes Postgres databases. So if you're moving from Heroku, that would be a nice familiarity you might have there. He mentions that it's really great for beginners. It does have a free tier. Fly.io is another one that he mentions. And then one that is a recent sponsor of our show here, platform.sh, which is just known as Platform SH, is, literally in their name, platform as a service. It is really geared for bigger organizations, in my opinion. There isn't much of a free tier at all. It does have a lot more features kind of built into it, and it has a lot of stuff for scaling your production up. They mention Google App Engine. We've done a couple tutorials on that if you want to look at that for things on Real Python to kind of learn a little bit about. Google offers like a $300 free credit thing to get you in as a new customer, so you can kind of play around in that environment. Google and Amazon as services, I guess probably Azure would be another one. All of them, their billing is, in my opinion, somewhat impenetrable. There's nickel and diming for every single thing that you're kind of involved with, which can be really confusing and sometimes a little scary when you hear the horror stories of, oh, I left this instance running and this blew up or whatever. Or usually it's the data science ones that I hear the most often, where like somebody was just running massive models and got this huge bill. So those ones are a little scarier than, say, like a Python application that you're hosting and you're looking at like a flat certain amount per month or what have you. It's a nice survey of all these different services. He also mentions the AWS Elastic Beanstalk, which is, again, kind of an application-based type of thing. Again, kind of leaning toward the serverless thing. Microsoft Azure App Service. And then probably the oddest duck out of the whole bunch is Python Anywhere, which is a really great service for just doing really simple stuff. The Django Girls tutorial that's out there uses it as a way to get going. It's like an online integrated development environment and a web hosting thing kind of all in one. They have a very simple free hosting for one small project, and then you kind of can grow from there. But it's not as elaborate, and there's not as many choices as far as like different services and things you would tie to. And there's definitely not things like scaling. It would be more of, hey, I want to experiment with putting my Python application up somewhere. I was surprised to see this in our list of PyCoder's articles for the week, and that it was like number one. So people are interested in looking at a survey like this and going through and comparing them. There's a couple other ones that are mentioned in here, one Railway.app and Netlify, Vercel, and Engine Yard, which are all ones I have heard very little about that I'd like to learn a little more about. And then I had asked you a little bit about one that you were using, and I think it kind of leaned more, you have to be a little more of a DevOps kind of person in the sense that you're setting up like a virtual machine, right? What was the one you use?
Yeah, I frequently work with a company that's called OpenStack. No affiliation, just happy with them.
Yeah.
If anybody was, remember the Web Faction days, also another little boutique place. It's by many of the same people. Web Faction got bought by GoDaddy. A bunch of them struck out on their own and created OpenStack. It's not quite platform as a service, which I kind of like. And I get the pros and cons of both.
Right.
You can get in and actually SSH to the box and you have full access to things. But there is also a dashboard through the web. And so for certain kinds of packages, and Django's one of them, you essentially just go in and go, I would like a new Django instance, please. And it creates all the stuff it needs to in a directory. And you essentially just overwrite the my app sample directory they give you with your Django folder and reboot, and you're ready to go.
Okay. So a bit like a template system.
Yeah, it's essentially a cookie cutter style mechanism that preps a bunch of things for you. So I like it personally because I find it gives me the flexibility because I'm still touching the Linux box when I need to.
Okay.
But it's not like I'm having to set all the servers up by hand, right? So like they have a hosted Postgres instance. So for my larger clients that I'm worried about the database, I hook it up to Postgres. For smaller clients where we don't care, it stays as a SQLite file inside of the operating system, right? So it gives you a fair amount of choice that way. It doesn't scale for you. You're essentially just getting a virtual instance. So once you get to, we have many thousands of clients per second or that kind of nonsense, then you've got to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I do a lot of work with customers who, they're if they're happy if they're getting 1,000 hits a month.
Right.
AWS tends to be overkill for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I just did a tutorial kind of review of something that's coming out soon where I needed to walk through setting up AWS, and I was mentioning this before we started. I haven't played with it in, I don't know, 3.5 years. I just haven't needed to in this position I'm in right now. And, it wasn't quite like riding a bike. It was like, okay, let me get going again here and setting it up. And if you're not a DevOps person, there's lots of little thorny things you got to kind of pay attention to kind of get things right. I was able to, accomplish it in the afternoon and get everything all set up and run, which was great. But I can really see the advantages of these sort of platform as a service kinds of things where, hey, I can maintain being a programmer and it can do a lot of the background stuff. And even just that extra step of like, hey, here's a template that has most of the things already configured as opposed to just raw configuration stuff. And even just like, I had to pick, which Linux box I was using. I had to update everything, install Python on it, set up my keys and all that kind of stuff. And, practice a lot of these tools that were just a slightly rusty, just because you just do different things, and that it's fun being a person who has to solve lots of different problems, but sometimes it's nice to focus on different things if that's not going to be your day in and day out. So lots of different choices here for you to kind of look through. And I think they really have a nice spectrum for what you might be searching for. What's your first article this week?
First one is called Python 3.12 Goals, Faster Cpython Ideas. So I know we're right on the crux of 3.11 being released, so I'm just going to skip that altogether and we're going to start talking about 3.12 next year already.
Yeah.
This article, did you hear my air quotes? It's a posting on GitHub, and it's connected to the Faster Python project, and it talks about the performance goals for 3.12. So 3.11, and we're going to talk about this a bit next week, introduced a new thing called an adaptive opcode specialization. And that's fancy talk for doing inline replacement of certain parts of the bytecode to improve performance. So say you've got a loop that's doing math on some floats. Python 3.11 can see this and replace the generic multiply with a float-specific multiply, making your code more efficient. It only does this for repeatedly visited operations, like in a tight loop or functions that you're calling frequently. So 3.12 is planning on building on this, sort of taking it to the next level. Some of the bytecode operations are going to be broken down into smaller intrinsic parts. So the simpler opcode should be able to provide more opportunity for optimization and make it easier to do just-in-time compilation type stuff. For our hardware geeks, this kind of echoes the idea that started happening in processors a couple decades back. The idea of taking assembly instructions were too big and unwieldy, so they got broken down into micro instructions, which Intel goes off and optimizes. The CPU does this for you, and you get better pipelining and all that kind of great stuff. So your compiler generates the same macro instructions, but the CPU figures out how to optimize it and give you instruction, branch prediction, all that kind of wonderful thing. So this is really the compiler, the Python compiler, doing a similar concept those basic codes are going to be broken down into building blocks. And the hope is that will help with speed. The next chunk that they want to work on is improving parallelism. So if you've been doing Python for a while, you've probably heard about the GIL. That's the global interpreter lock. It's a single global lock on Python for when certain kinds of operations are happening, and it's a big restriction when you're doing multi-threaded code. There have been many projects over the years to try and improve or remove the GIL. And in fact, some of the Cpython competitors are based on the idea of we don't want a GIL, but it's extremely difficult to remove it and still support backwards compatibility with C extensions. So in 3.12, they're planning on moving the GIL into the sub interpreter. So a sub interpreter is like a tiny little copy of the interpreter that is currently only available in the C API. But by moving the GIL down there, C extensions can get their own lock. And essentially that means the C extension will lock itself, but that won't affect other C extensions. So this isn't a complete GILectomy, but it does mean less of the system is locked. And so more parts should be able to run in parallel. So that should be an interesting step forward. They're also looking at optimizing the size of certain key data structures. This affects things like the classes, how reference counts and garbage collection is done. And by shrinking these things, the objects should result in overall shrinking of the memory footprint, and as well as the ability to cache things. And you never know, but there are certain things, because of the way hardware boundaries work and how much memory you read at a time and all the rest of that kind of stuff, often in these kinds of cases, if you can shrink it below certain boundaries, it causes speed up. You're seeing a bit of this happen inside of 3.11. They've written an improvement for how exceptions work, and that improvement has shrunk. It's removed 240 bytes. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you've got that 240 bytes on every single function call, all of a sudden some of your functions are going to be to load faster and into the CPU in a single call. And so there's all these neat little side effects by shrinking memory. So they're trying to shrink more memory. So that's most of what's covered, but there's also a list of other bits and pieces. We'll provide the links like we usually do. And there's a related post from Guido about how to take all this talk and turn it into an actual plan. So if the high level article isn't enough for you, you can go in and look at the actual details of, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. So there's some interesting content in here. Already, I'm looking forward to 2023.
Yeah. As you read through that, it just reminds me of the last 2 years of conversations I've had about this stuff and where all these different ideas are coming from. Lots of conversations about JIT, just-in-time compilers that I've had with a handful of people, the idea of sub-interpreters and different ways that could be handled, and all these other little optimizations. That definitely, it's neat to have this, group of people, and I guess the funding, with Microsoft really helping them to have truly a faster Cpython project going.
Well, and all of these things come out of PEPs, right? So you always sort of see it. It's like, oh, hey, that's an interesting idea. And then it's like 6 months later and like, oh, they seem to be doing it. And 6 months later, it's like, oh, hey, it's in the release, right? So you sort of see these pieces out. I did find an interesting sort of little extrapolation because, 3.9 increased speed, 3.10 increased speed, 3.11 increased speed. And if you follow the pattern, I think about 3 versions from now, the code will be finished before you run it. So if we just keep speeding it up, we'll be able to reach into the future and spit out your answer. It'll be fantastic. That curve will flatten off eventually, but we're still making progress.
Yeah, truly. That's good. Time series data runs almost every technology, but building real-time apps in legacy databases can be a nightmare to manage. At InfluxData, creator of the time series data platform InfluxDB, they built their time series platform with tools so developers don't have to make wholesale changes to their product or application just to use InfluxDB. InfluxDB is optimized for developer productivity, so developers can build IoT, analytics, and cloud applications quickly and at scale. Check it out and start for free today at influxdata.com. That's influxdata.com. So my next one is what I thought was going to be a really super short article on Real Python. It actually ended up having some interesting stuff, and I did learn a couple of things inside of it. It's by Philip, who I mentioned last week. He has written an article titled, "When Do You Use an Ellipsis in Python?" If you're not familiar with it, an ellipsis is the 3 dots that you sometimes see in a Python script, or you might see it occasionally in things like type hints and a couple other different places. An ellipsis in English indicates that you're leaving something out. I use them a lot. I I use it a lot when I text. I don't know. I just kind of want to I think I use it as my own weird form of humor, and you can imagine what happened next kind of thing. But something I didn't know is that the ellipsis is also written as an actual constant, the word ellipsis with a capital E. And if you were to use the comparator of is, so you could say ellipsis is ... and it would return true, which is kind of cool. I've never seen the word used inside of a Python program, but it was intriguing to see that. So he goes are kind of 3 main uses of where you might have seen this. Maybe it's the time when I began Python, which isn't that long ago, but my main way I would see a placeholder being used was the keyword of pass. And so you would see maybe as you're building something structurally and you want to say, okay, I'll go ahead and name this function. I'll actually define it, and I'll say define my function parentheses colon, and then maybe the next line indented in, you would see just pass. And the idea is that it would be kind of a to-do. My code will still run. You can even call this function, but it just does nothing. It just passes through and continues on. And the trend that I have been seeing is the ... instead. And probably the most common place I've seen it is when someone's sharing code, which I think is really smart, especially if it's proprietary code inside of an organization or something like that, and they want to ask a question about it or something like that. They could say, well, I have these functions here. This one's named this ... and so it doesn't have to include the actual body of it. And so it's a common way of implying code be here, and the code still would run. It just doesn't do anything. And so it's kind of a nice placeholder in that way. And so I thought, okay, that was going to be it. That's all we were going to talk about in this article. But he then goes into how it's being used in type checking. And that can be used in a couple ways. I was like, oh yeah, I've seen it in type checking, mainly in these sort of stubs that you would see in something like TypeShed. I don't know if you've heard of the TypeShed repo, where they're adding type hints to a lot of code that are additional libraries that are out there that maybe don't have type hints inside them, so that they might behave in the way that we like inside of a fancy IDE of getting autocomplete and things like that. And I would see it where the function, the main calling of it would have annotations of what the variables are that are being, what you are setting as parameters going in, and what would be returned, and what the types of those things are. But the body of the function would just be dot dot dot, indicating that this thing's going to happen here. And that's a way that you can kind of define these things, which I think is kind of neat. And then the other way that it's used is a way that actually I've seen in other languages, where they're doing this sort of specification of, if you're defining something in type hints and it maybe could have a variable length in the tuple, and it's homogeneous, meaning that, like, okay, you could say int comma dot dot dot, and that means that, okay, it could be 1 or it could be 7 ints or something like that that could be sent into this function. So the article goes a little deeper into that stuff and kind of shows it. And what's interesting is I kind of looked around at other languages that seems to be a fairly common use. In I think JavaScript uses something similar in some cases, to sort of show this list of arguments potentially inside of a callable. He gives one other use that I won't go into the details of, but this is another use I've seen in a couple other languages. This is specifically in NumPy, where he's talking about how it could be used to do a form of slicing, kind of tearing into some kind of matrix of things and pulling, everything up to here. And, you can get into the details of the article to kind of learn a little more about that if you are interested in kind of that shorthand of that operator. But I had a kind of a question for you. Like, there's one last thing that you might have seen it, which is like in a REPL, as you hit return, if you're not completed in a line, it provides a dot 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 automatically, but it's just really a secondary prompt allowing you to write out like a function inside of a REPL type environment where you're completing something. Along with it indicating a spread of things, I've seen like in Bash, where it could be used to do all the numbers in between, say 1 and 9. You could do 1 comma dot 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 comma 9, which is kind of interesting. I've seen that in some other languages. Are there other uses in JavaScript, or is just the one I'm thinking of?
It's not an operator. It's one of the more new items in JavaScript.
Okay.
So I don't do a lot of ES6, so I don't know when they introduced it, but I've seen it kicking around.
Yeah.
But I think, as far as I'm aware, I think it's just there for variable number of arguments.
Yeah. Seems to be common in lots of languages that way.
Yeah. The kind of thing we would use.
It's one of these things that I have been intrigued that over the last 3-4 years of using Python, I do see it more and more, where I was just seeing pass in its place, for like a function definition. And now we have a couple different new uses in the case of like type hints and stuff. So yeah, it's a nice little article kind of diving into concept of it, and, when and where you would use it, and growing a lot of people's familiarity with it.
I always forget it's there. I still use pass. I
Yeah.
really should learn it. It'll save me a keystroke. But I always forget it's there.
All right. So what do you got next?
So this is a real Python article called Custom Python Strings Inheriting from, I'm going to call it STR for now so that we don't confuse things, versus UserString. So last few episodes, I've been talking about my own courses, and this week I promise I'm not doing that. So of course, now I'm talking about a Leodonis article, because what else is there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if he intended it, but this article's kind of a little sneaky. Nominally, it's about writing custom features for strings and how you can override them, but it kind of ends up being an accidental tutorial on object-oriented ideas in Python, how it all fits together. So it starts out showing you how to write your own string class that has a word count method. So you inherit from the str object and add a new method that counts words on the internal string. So far, so good. It's really add a method. It's not a big challenge. The next step is to attempt to write a new string class that automatically turns whatever you constructed it with into lowercase. And he walks you through what you might think is the first logical approach, and you overload dunder init like you usually do with classes, and then it fails. And you can't do this. It results in an exception. And that's because in Python, strings are immutable. So when you try to call super dunder init on your class, it blows up.
Yeah.
So in order to get around this, you have to do something a little deeper, which isn't part of the usual intro to Python object-oriented stuff. And that's to use dunder new. So to build this lower string class, you overload dunder new instead of dunder init. And this is what I mean by sneaky. So you just learned about a little more about how objects are really constructed in Python. And every once in a while, I come across somebody who gets all cranky with me when I call dunder init a constructor. Because Python's not my first coding language, my vocabulary from other languages tends to leak through once in a while. And these finicky people are technically correct, which is the best kind of correct. Futurama shout out. And how they're technically correct is that dunder new is actually the constructor, whereas dunder init, it's where you initialize your variables.
Yeah.
So other object-oriented languages don't make this distinction, and hence why old people like me say constructor. So minutes ago, I mentioned the title, inheriting from str versus UserString. And if you remember back that far, you might be able to guess where this goes next. So Python has another way of building string-like things. That's the UserString object, which can be found in the collections module. UserString is a wrapper class to the str data type, and as such, you can build on top of it by overloading the dunder init method, kind of like what you'd expect. So essentially, you can do that first attempt. You can do that if you're inheriting from UserString instead of from str. The rest of the article walks you through how to modify a whack of dunder methods in order to make a string class that behaves as if it were mutable. So again, sneaky. So not only do you have a better understanding of all these string-like things, but by the time you're done, you've got an idea of how constructors really work and some of the mutation methods like dunder set item and dunder delete item. So it's, as often I find with Leodonis' stuff, it's like, oh, this should be a simple article. And then you get into the loads of the depth of how things work.
Surprise.
And there's some really good insight in here. So yay, Leodonis.
Yeah, I dig it. I like the example where, yeah, try it out. It'll blow up in your face, kind of thing. Yeah. You're like, oh, what a great way to find out. Yeah, and I've been actually learning. He's been writing a lot about this sort of stuff lately, and Darren Jones has been turning them into video courses, and so I've been kind of diving pretty deep into, multiple constructors, quote unquote, things like that, and kind of learning that real big difference between new and init, which isn't typically covered in object-oriented Python, like kind of like the level 1 kind of stuff.
Appropriately, right? Like it's not
Right.
necessary. You're needing, generally, if you're starting to touch dunder new, you're starting to muck about. You're getting into like metaprogramming land or close to it, right? So it's an interesting conceptual thing. Like I said, you don't see it in a lot of languages, so it's one of the weird little corner cases of Python.
Yeah, and why you need to be technically accurate.
Yeah.
I guess. Cool. All right. That takes us into our discussion this week, and why we were laughing at the very beginning of the program is it's a Hacker News thread, and it starts with just aging programmer. And we're like, oh no. And so Steve Perkins writes more of a comment than a question. First sentence, I'm approaching 50. Period. And we both kind of laughed. And the two Christophers here are both, let's say, older than Steve. So, I was reading through this. It was very interesting. He's talking a lot about when he thinks he's going to retire, or even having the option to retire. The next couple of years look like they might not be fun, which is kind of interesting. He's talked about getting different roles, and again, it's really more of just like, hey, this is happening to me and I've been thinking about it. And then, man, it's a big thread. It really blew up and went in multiple directions. And so I thought we could talk about a handful of different things, some of it being hiring, or being the programmer and trying to find a job as somebody who's a little bit older, hoping that, HR isn't committing atrocities across the board and only hiring people that they think can survive the gauntlet of programming or what have you. But it ended up bringing up a lot of different thoughts as I kind of went through it and looked at it, sort of subtopics. And you said you had a couple, so maybe we could start with yours, and then I got my big list.
Sure. One of the things that I kind of found as I was reading through it is there is, at risk of going into all kids these days,
Right.
there definitely is a generational difference in approach, right? And there was this great phrase that I saw in it, which was, "They're inventing things faster than I can acquire them."
Yeah.
And this is what I mean by a generational thing. When I started out, there was really two programming languages that were taken seriously, right? There's more versions of Python than that.
True. Yeah.
So, and I see it as well, not just in that, but there's also, it was very, very difficult to learn anything about computers without understanding the hardware when I started out, because you were operating at that level.
Yeah.
And when I talk to younger folks, it always surprises me that they've just abstracted it away. And part of me, because it's the way I learned. I'm sure the first people who said, "Yeah, you know what, we don't need to teach Latin in school," all went, "Wait, well, but that's how you teach language, right?" So I'm not kind of on both sides of it, right? Like, I think there's value in understanding those things, and I think there's reasons why some programs blow up, because hey, you ran out of memory, and that used to be a thing you had to think about all the time.
Right.
So I think there's definitely it's not just age. I think what we've been exposed to and what your first programming language is, and those things all influence you over your career. So that I thought was kind of interesting. Some of it has changed over time as well. Like, I'm just as bad as everybody else when it comes to copy and paste from Stack Overflow and Google Answers and all the rest of it. None of that existed when I started.
Right.
And I suspect that part of my brain that used to have to figure it out for myself has atrophied because, right? So some of that, although there's a generational change, some of that, those of us who've been through it have changed with it as well. Because nobody's saying, yeah, I need 300 pounds of paperback books on my bookshelf to look this stuff up. Of course, Google it, right? Like, that's just the answer. So
Yeah, definitely. I have a weird path. It probably ad nauseum talked about it down here, but I started very early programming and basic and so forth at home and played around, and then went to college and did Fortran and C for a little bit, and then really disappeared completely. And so coming back into programming, because I always was very interested in it, and then diving really deep into lots of languages all at once. So I feel like I kind of jumped in the pool late in life. Now, I am a person who is very interested in constantly learning, but I don't think it matters what age you are as far as that sort of eagerness to learn, which I think is like probably the biggest factor that I always kind of emphasize on here. And definitely I'll talk about it again next week with Pablo. We actually kind of went into a nice additional conversation after we talked about memory, kind of seeing that inside a team or a potential employee, this idea of eagerness to learn, because it is going to be constantly changing. And that is something that I think a lot of people who, look at somebody who's an older programmer and think, oh, well, they're going to be set in their ways. And I think that really just depends on the person, and if they've lasted this long in the industry, potentially they're really interested in change and have learned lots of ways of going about it, but it totally depends on the person.
yeah, well, it's also a balancing act as well, right? So you would hope that with experience, you know when to use the new shiny thing and when not to.
Right.
And so there's there's always that conversation of which side of that am I on, right? Am I saying we should use this tool because it actually is a good choice and we're going to get bit if we do something else, or am I saying that because I don't want to learn? And there's almost a psychology aspect to it that's hard to suss out, right?
Yeah. And then there's these interesting sort of junior senior dev kind of things in there, and all these kids today, they just need to slow down, I'll remove the expletives. Frantically copying and pasting and watching them Google stuff and, pasting stuff in, and then just like, oh, wow, that didn't work. And then they don't completely remove it and then, go on and so forth. And I think of that when I think of potentially these additional new tools beyond the internet that kind of came in between, right? Of what is an older program going to be doing, but like looking at code that's been auto-generated and does this actually compile and run and or whatever, which is kind of intriguing to think about. Like I think that's always a problem, and it kind of depends on where people are coming from. And one of the other things that they talked about quite a bit is the idea of moving from job to job and potentially building those connections and building a network, which is definitely a thing that I think I've even mentioned it on here about how that's really worked well for me. Other people would just mention just my ability to learn how to do stuff to a different team, and then potentially I was being cherry picked, and moved over to something else, some other interesting projects. But often, you get into this new job, and we have like talked about it a ton on here also about preparing for that interview and potentially having an interview exam. And there's a few articles that I thought were interesting from like 2007. There's like on Coding Horror, it's a Jeff Atwood site, where why is FizzBuzz a simple sort of program presented in a coding interview? Because a lot of people coming out of school potentially couldn't actually write it. They couldn't piece together simple code, which I thought was interesting. And you had mentioned that, well, that might be just them going through the entire stack of potential candidates and not really looking at the resume with like a bit keener of an eye.
When I've been on the hiring side of the table, I've tried just about everything. I've done some coding test type things. I have found that people who did really well on the coding test did miserably in the interview, and weren't necessarily good programmers if I happened to hire them. So I kind of backed away from coding tests. I would occasionally do the whiteboard thing. I was never a big fan of it, but I'm fully understand that coding on a whiteboard isn't anything like coding on a machine.
Right.
I find I tend to personally try to go to let's have a design conversation. Let's talk about a problem I'm actually trying to solve right now.
Sure.
And let's see
how do you think?
Whether or not, because this is what we'll be doing if I hire you. We're going to be talking like this.
Right.
And once in a while that devolves into, oh, okay. So I have run into sort of the FizzBuzz problem with things like interns and things like that.
Yeah.
But the bar there is completely different. Usually there you're looking to make sure that they're not a negative contributor. And right,
will you damage my code if I hire you,
or just eat up everybody's time or whatever? Right, the bar is completely different with interns and co-ops than it is with, say, I'm trying to hire a senior developer or whatever. Right.
Okay.
But the other aspect of this too, to bring it back to the age piece, is this is a really weird industry, right? Like we think of it as a norm because we're all in it and it's huge and it runs the world, but it's a bubble, right? Like most of my wife's extended family are in construction, and at my age, they're going, I can't do this anymore. My body hurts.
Right.
And you look at the older guy, your Walmart greeters or your grocery store baggers, right? And most of us are never gonna, like, except for the fact of repetitive stress injuries,
right?
We can
Potentially,
keep working, right? Like, one of the things I had a cousin talk to me as he was approaching retirement. One of the things he just kept doing was he just kept increasing the price of his contracts. And he's like, when no one will pay, I'll stop working. And this is a brilliant mechanism, right? And this is something that
feels like a lawyer.
Like you just, and what'll happen is that if you're at the point where you could retire and you're just trying to keep going and do something to keep your brain going, you turn the price up and people keep saying yes, and you won't get as much work, but that's fine because you're trying to ease it off anyways. And the day you finally stop is the day no one will give you a contract anymore. But but the ageism thing definitely is an issue. I've seen it in the industry.
Yeah,
it is thought of as a young person's game. But a lot of the things that were talked about in the forum, and a lot of the things that we've been talking about with the interviews, quite frankly, it applies to almost everybody too, right? Like that there's, how many certificates did you get? Well, for some programmers that helps them get the job. And for other programmers, they're like, why would I want to do that? Right. And for some companies, you can't get in the door without them. And other companies, it's like, well, why would I care? Right. So,
right. I've heard the heat on either side of that for the certification stuff. And the other part I thought was interesting was like, maybe they should look at what they've been doing outside. Like, do they have a portfolio work? And there was a really interesting one where they were talking about, have they done open source contributions? And
you see, I hate that. No other industry does that.
Right. But they said, well, actually, I think that counts against you in certain things. And I was like,
right.
Because that means that I don't know what it means exactly, what they're thinking behind it, but potentially that you do have other options, or that you're going to be working outside,
Yeah. But
or what have you.
like,
Yeah.
I love to look at somebody's GitHub profile because it means I can actually see what their real code is like. And if you're starting out in the industry and you don't have experience, that's great. If you truly believe in contributing and you get to do that, that's fantastic. But we are no other industry. No, the bricklayers don't come along and go, so how much bricklaying do you do in your spare time? It's
Yeah, totally.
right? It, I
Yeah.
understand the
Well, I built a
desire.
barbecue.
Yeah, I understand the desire of the question because it implies that you're passionate about it. But
Yeah.
people need to have lives as well.
Yeah, I wonder about the influence of the startup culture,
Yeah.
you should be giving how many hundreds of hours or whatever. And I think I'm seeing that dissolve a little bit potentially, but like at least it's being exposed in some of the circles that I watch. I'm kind of maintaining a look at, and maybe the pandemic is part of it. Like people kind of realize like, wow, I'm burning myself out, by overachieving.
Well, I honestly think it goes far deeper than that, and at risk of very much sounding like an old man, the next generation down seems to have a better idea of what this looks like.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
millennials seem to have a far stronger grasp on work-life balance and than say Gen X ever did. Um, so which is funny because we're supposed to be the slacker generation, so you'd think it would have been
Yeah.
us, but, is what it
Yeah,
is.
too funny. All right, well, we'll leave that as an open thing because we're old. Um, can always come back and talk about it. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It dives further into a topic that we touch on this week. It's titled Providing Multiple Constructors in Your Python Classes. The course is based on a Real Python article by Leodan Esposo Ramos. And in the video course, instructor Darren Jones shows you how to use optional arguments and type checking to simulate multiple constructors, how to write multiple constructors using the built-in class method decorator, and how to overload your class constructors using the single dispatch method decorator. You also get a peek under the hood at how Python internally constructs instances of a regular class and how some standard library classes provide multiple constructors. Having the tools to provide multiple constructors will help you write flexible classes that you can adapt to changing needs. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. Let's dive into projects. What'd you bring this week?
Sure. So this one, I was looking at a tool called difftastic. Technically not a Python tool, but a tool that supports Python. So what difftastic does is give you diff information on code with the added benefit that it actually understands the code.
Oh, nice.
It understands over 30 different programming languages, and Python's one of them. And you end up with far more useful diffs because it's actually diffing code trees rather than just say line by line. So I just finished recording the course of the new features in Python 3.11. And part of that course shows off a new concept inside of Async.io called a task group. And in order to explain how that works, I had some 3.10 code and some 3.11 code that uses the new feature. And as you would guess, those two pieces of code are fairly similar, but all the code does is create some parallel routines, and how they're spawned is slightly different. So when I run a diff on those scripts, if a regular diff would basically just say, hey, all these lines have changed.
Yeah.
What difftastic says is, oh, you seem to be using the same factory here, and this part are, different base objects, but the function that you're passing into the factory is the same. So you're seeing things far more specific to how Python actually works.
Nice signposting there, as opposed to just different.
Yeah, exactly. So like if you think of a simple use case, which would be say like an if statement. Say you've got an if statement, and then you go back into your code and you need to make it multi-line. You got to add another clause. So an old diff would highlight both of those lines because you've added like a continuation character and you've added a new clause. Difftastic would actually say, oh, that this line is the same and just you've added the clause and highlight the difference character rather than saying the lines are different. So there's some interesting kind of highlighting to this and a different way of kind of looking at your code. It automatically detects what language you're processing, but it also supports a dash dash language flag in case whatever you're feeding it it's not happy with. And it can compare files as well as directories, just like regular diff, and has some fine-grained arguments for highlighting how you change the highlighting and how it incorporates, so that if you're plugging it into, say, an IDE or into Git or one of those other tools that integrate with diff, it supports doing that, and you can change how things are highlighted. The core coder is a gentleman named Wilford Hughes, but there's like 230 contributors, so there's a lot of activity going on.
Wow.
Yeah, and they were updating even just a couple weeks ago. So so if this is this might help you find out what's changed in your code or be able to look at your code in a different way from before. So another little useful tool for your toolkit.
Nice. I guess following the theme, mine is a GitHub project called Refurb. Refurbish and modernize your Python code bases. It's by, well, the GitHub name is Dosisod, Dosisod. Nice palindrome there. His name's Luke. And it's kind of a cross of things. It's not as elaborate a refactoring tool as something like Sorcery. And it's not really purely a linter. It's a tool, again, they say for refurbishing and modernizing Python code bases. So the idea is, what are things that have changed in the language to make it more elegant and work smoother and more modernly, if you will? Things like using pathlib is one of them. Even just the ability to do, instead of having like a context manager of with open as multiple lines of stuff, to read a text file, you could use path, calling path, and then read text, which is, again, optimizing a lot of things. Looking at and the or statements, how you might have, if you have like a chain of those, like ways that you could probably do that with a sort of a comparator, simplifying. There's like all kinds of little ones that are in it, and they keep adding them. So again, it's not 100% the same as like refactoring, but partly because it has these nice CLI flags that have the ability to kind of show you why they're different. One of the first examples they show is, maybe you're coming from a different language where you have to assign a variable type and tell it what the type is. And so like you type something like name equals str, and then in parentheses, you put the string Bob, quotation marks around it. Well, you don't need to do that in Python. You don't need to cast a variable during assignment. That's not like something that needs to happen, but a beginner might have had to do that in a different language and set up what this variable is going to be. You just, in Python, you just put name equals and then quotation marks Bob, and that makes it a string because you've basically assigned it to a literal string. And the same with like a number, like an integer or a float or what have you. And so like it would make a suggestion there and then explain why that's happening. It has also a flag for ignoring certain types of errors. It's got a really nice CLI to it. And you can also set it up in a pre-commit way, the way you might do for Black or iSort, which is another one that got mentioned this week again. We've talked about it ourselves on E100, and then also episode 97, I talked to Adam Johnson about iSort. So lots of these little tools that you could kind of put in your tool belt to kind of say, well, am I doing this properly? Am I doing this in kind of a smart way, in a Pythonic kind of way? So yeah, I thought it was kind of a neat little package called Refurb.
Yeah, so there's interesting stuff in there. When if I remember correctly, when I found it, it was through a Hacker News conversation talking about it.
Oh, okay.
The opinion in the discussion part seemed to be mixed as to whether or not you should use it in a CI/CD sort of scenario. And part of that was because some of the suggestions are the kinds of things that are opinionated.
Very opinionated it is, yeah.
Yeah. And this is what, as soon as the internet's involved, someone's going to speak up. But that's not how you do that. And
Right.
the examples I saw were great, and I could see it as a kind of the same way I use a linter, where I'm sort of, okay,
Very linter like.
here, okay, do it as part of my process. I don't know whether personally I'd put it in the CI/CD, or if I was working with like an older code base or something.
Right. That's something it does, right? Because it runs in 3.10
Yeah.
Only, but it will look at code that's been written in 3.6 and up.
Yes, which, and if you're wondering why is it 3.10, this is one of, the underlying implementation uses the new match mechanism.
Okay.
So there's another reason to go looking at this. If you want to see a real use case for that new match feature, this refurbs a code base that you can take a look at there for this.
Yeah.
I think it would have been handy to have a tool like this, particularly as you were saying, going Python 2.7 to Python 3, because
Sure.
It highlights exactly hey, we've got a better way of doing that now, right? So
Yeah.
so if you're touching older code bases, or if you're trying to clean something up, or if you're trying to drop, you've got something that's been kicking around since 3.1 and you're trying to drop your 3.2, 3.3, 3.6 support because all of that's dead now. Running a tool like this could also result in removal of certain kinds of imports and things, as well as you get rid of the older stuff.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again for bringing all these PyCoders articles and projects, Christopher.
Always fun.
Talk to you soon. And don't forget, InfluxDB time series platform is available in the cloud, on premises, or locally. Get started for free today at influxdata.com. I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.